Ms. Comstock, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Really, this has really been a fascinating hearing and topic, and thank you for holding this hearing. I was meeting with some folks last week on this about the caucus, so they did highlight they needed more diversity in the caucus, so I do plan on joining it, and thank you for highlighting the caucus too. In my opening statement, I referenced the Office of Personnel Management data breach and the OPM notifying us, and I was wondering if you could go into some more detail on how we could use that technology to better protect personal and sensitive data stored by the government. Sure.
So, Chairwoman Comstock, we are working with companies, as I referenced. One is SecureKey in Canada, and I think that's probably the furthest along to proving out digital identity on blockchain, as well as working with the Sovereign Foundation, who's working on digital identity protocol standards on blockchain. In the case in Canada, they've gathered a ecosystem of all the major banks, province of Ontario, British Columbia, and others, to form a digital rights management system is probably the best way I can word it, where citizens are the rightful owners of their data, and they basically, in a very simple interface that's not much more complicated than your Facebook app, I'll give permission. For example, if I go to a real estate company to rent an apartment, I'll give my bank and my DMV permission to answer any of the questions, almost like it's a music license. I'm giving them license to answer my question. And vice versa, I'm giving the folks answering the question the right to answer the question. And there are stipulations even in NIST talking about avoiding honeypots of data. And I think a lot of the major security breaches, it's a good idea not to put all your eggs in one basket. Mm-hmm. And one of the misnomers about using blockchain for identity is that you actually put personal identity information on the ledger. You don't. You put proofs and permissions. You put the digital rights on it. And it becomes almost a routing system for how you can have people interact with accountability on your identity information and making it far less visible. And last but not least, it's much harder to track your identity and usage. So there's stipulations about these things called triple blind data exchange, where the requester doesn't know who the provider is, the provider doesn't know who the requester is, and the network provider doesn't know either. And that makes it, again, very thorough to know so that only the parties who need to know actually get to know.
Okay. Dr. Romine?
Yes, from my perspective, I think the important issue here is that as Mr. Cuomo mentioned, storing PII in the blockchain itself is not recommended. This is not something that you want to do. And the example that Mr. Jaikaran used for access to medical records points that out. The medical records themselves still are retained on the private servers of the medical provider, but access management, access control, and auditability of access is provided through blockchain. So there are opportunities here to do some really interesting things in this space.
Okay, Mr. Jaikaran?
Yes, ma'am. What may be particularly interesting is not the use of blockchain technology itself to protect sensitive data, but some of the technologies that underpin blockchain. So public-private key encryption, hashing, and particularly logging, so that we know when data is being used, we know who is accessing that data, and we know when data is being changed. Those technologies, particularly for very sensitive information that's not published to the blockchain, can certainly help protect data that we have today.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms.